Hi everybody. We're going to get started with the next of our seminars. I'd like to do a welcome to country first. And so RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders, past and present. RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. I just want to say a few words about the seminar series that we're presenting you with today. We have a suite of different kinds of seminars, and Jules and I and the research committee haven't really put together a research capacity building seminar to date. And so I just want to acknowledge Professor Timothy Bartram, who had this fantastic series of capacity building seminars that I personally really enjoyed when I started at RMIT, and they were some of the most valuable experiences for me, and they were really well attended and I think well appreciated. And we've pulled them all together so that we've got some oversight of the different kinds of seminars that we run. And so today is the first of our research capacity building seminars under the one banner. And I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Andrew Timming to you. So Andrew's a professor of HRM, and he's also the head of the Department of Management, International Business and Entrepreneurship at RMIT. Andrew is going to give us a really interesting view into the backstage, to use a Goffman term, of how editors kind of review and analyse, dish out, make decisions about manuscripts that they receive. And so it's kind of going to be, I think, I've had the privilege of looking at a slide deck already, and I think everyone will probably enjoy these insights, because while we might review ourselves for journals, maybe not that many of us are actually editors of journals. So Andrew has some really interesting research interests himself. He's a professor of HRM, as I've just mentioned, but his research interests cover a range of things like evolutionary biology, stigma, tattoos, and how they affect recruitment practices and so on. And one of the things I particularly appreciate about Andrew's approach to academia is his promotion of really civil discourse. And if you're kind of keep up with Andrew's Twitter accounts and his contributions to the department, that comes through really, really strongly. So I'll just hand over to Andrew. You can fill in any gaps. We're really looking forward to it. We'll see you in a bit. Oh, I haven't heard anyone talk. Oh, I've just been asked to check if you can hear us. I think that's a yes. Okay, thanks.
All right, good. Thank you so much, Prue, and also thanks go to Jules for organizing this. I do have to apologize up front. I have to leave at 12:15. I can't stay for the whole time. I have a teaching at 12:30, and I have some industry partners I have to meet beforehand. So I'll try and get through this as quickly as I can without, cutting short any of the important insights, but also to allow some time for question and answer at the end, because I imagine you'll have some questions after my presentation. I don't know what's going on. I must have accidentally hit the automatic button.
I think it'll be in the transitions, Andrew. I'll just come and turn it off.
I'm a Luddite. I don't know.
No. I think it will be here. And so now that should be okay. Let's just, all right, we're good.
No, it's still going.
Oh. On mouse click. Let me save it. The automatic
Seems to
transitions are
automatically
on.
go.
No, that's okay.
The arrows don't work?
No, I think we're good now.
We're good?
Yeah.
Okay,
Let's
good.
just, no.
No, no.
No, see, it heard you say I had to leave at 12:15, so.
I have a solution.
Hang on,
I'll just deliver it like this.
Let me try one more. Let me try one more. I think we're good.
All right.
I think. And otherwise we might just need to. Do you want me to go from the, do you want me to? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'll just do it like this,
Try.
yeah?
Can we just give it one more go? Yeah.
People can see it.
I think you're okay.
Nice one.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
Well done, Kurt.
That was good, wasn't it? So who is this guy? Why should we listen to this guy? What does he know about editing? I have a bit of experience for my sins, I would say, in this area. I'm currently the inaugural registered reports editor at Human Resource Management Journal, and I'm finishing up a 3-year term as an associate editor at the International Journal of Human Resource Management. That journal shouldn't be at the end there. I'm a former associate editor at Human Resource Management Journal. I'm currently sitting on the editorial boards of Human Resource Management, that's the US one, Group and Organization Management, and the Journal of Controversial Ideas. And I'm also a former member of the editorial board of Work, Employment, and Society. In fact, that was the first editorial board that I ever joined, was Work, Employment, and Society, which was brutal, let me tell you, because Work, Employment, and Society, they don't use external reviewers. Everything goes into the editorial board. So I was averaging about 20 papers a year that I was reviewing, and that doesn't count the round 2s and round 3s, et cetera. So brutal, but definitely worth my while, because if you join an editorial board, you get a really good insight into the mistakes that other people make, and it dramatically, I think, increases the quality of your own writing. So I've structured this presentation in sort of 2 parts. The first part is, as Prue said, to give you a sort of behind the scenes look of what editors do and our sort of day-to-day or week-to-week life. And then in the second half of the presentation, I'm actually going to jump into some of the insights that I've gleaned over the years as an editor that I hope you'll be able to take away and improve the quality of your own research. So when you log into Manuscript Central, you'll see home and you'll see author and review, but you probably won't see the next tab over, which is manage. And that's where I go into the editor center, or the associate editor center, in order to see which papers have been allocated me to handle as an editor. My original thought was it would be nice to be able to go into this and just share on the screen, but unfortunately there's a lot of sort of confidential information on there. I have the names of everyone who submitted and all the reviewers and everything like that. So I couldn't actually show you. I've just managed to just grab a few screenshots to give you a general overview. This is actually quite tame. It usually looks much worse than this, but I'd actually gone through and sort of cleared out a lot of papers in my editor pipeline. But basically, this is where I go in the first instance when I log in. I can see that there are 6 select reviewers. So there's 6 papers that have been submitted, allocated to me, and I need to review for the first time, read them for the first time, screen them. At this stage, among those 6, I can either desk reject those papers, which I do in about maybe 50% of the papers that I receive. But if after reviewing those papers, I feel that they stand a reasonable chance of success in peer review, at that stage, I can invite reviewers. Invite reviewers means that's usually the second one, is if a revise and resubmit has come back and it already has the previous reviewer selected in it, then that goes into that category. And then I have my make decision category as well. These are ones where all the reviews have been returned and I need to go back and reread the paper and then reread the reviews and then make the final decision there.
So Andrew, the invite review is when a paper is back and you need to see what referee says and then possibly return back to reviewers. But the other one is like 2-3 times of back and forth, and this is the final stage for you to make a decision.
So the invite reviewers is for around, 2 or 3 or however many. And I'll show you in the next few slides, but I can decide after I've read the paper at that stage, if I feel like I'm ready to make a decision, then I can shift to the next window, which I'll show you. Otherwise, I can re-invite those same reviewers to do the same thing over and over again. So say if I log into that invite reviewers, I'll see here all the information about the paper and who the reviewers were, and I'll have access to the PDF and everything. And then to the right, I have this here. So by default, it says I have 3 reviews that are required to make the decision. But if I read the second round or the third round or the fourth round and decide that everything is good, I change that 3 to a 0. And once I change that 3 to a 0, then the paper moves into the make decision folder. And finally, this is where the magic happens. I get to make a decision. I can decide to obviously accept. I can have minor reviews, minor revisions, major revisions, or I can reject. And when I do that, I don't just tick reject and then commit decision. I tick reject and then create draft email down here so I can tailor a little bit of the comments. You may not know this, but since I'm showing you behind the scenes, actually, we have pre-populated these template emails. So if it's a rejection, there's a pre-populated template for rejection. If it's a major revision, pre-populated template for major revision, minor revision, and an accept. So oftentimes what editors do is we go through the pre-populated one and we erase the stuff that's not relevant. We keep the stuff that is relevant, but we're also expected to add our own, say, paragraph that is specifically tailored to your paper. And let me tell you this, there's no better information you can use to improve your paper than that paragraph, especially if you get a rejection. Reviewers often look for problems that aren't there, but editors don't do that. We don't have the time to do that. So when I read through a paper and I see there are a few problems, those are the real problems, right? Not the ones that I'm looking to invent. Those are the real problems with your paper. So if you get actual feedback from an editor, pay more attention to that than any other feedback you get from anyone else, because we're not here to waste our time, putting together a whole long email pointing out all the sort of minor problems. We really pick out, say, the 3 or 4 big problems that stood out during our review.
And may I just add a little, I never have been editor, but I've been referee. And as a referee, that's our task.
Mm-hmm.
To find issues.
Yeah.
Because you can't just say this is great. This is a bit of an obligation. So I absolutely agree with you that the editor, when the editor finds a problem, that's a serious one. But the referee, of course, you have to answer it. But there is a bit of a referee and editor have a different hat.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a tough job. I don't know if I would recommend this job. I certainly recommend an editorial board. I think it would be worth your while. But it takes a real special person to take on editorial work, and especially, I guess, maybe for someone as young as myself, it's pretty unusual. And the reason it's pretty unusual is really the second point here on my slides. I'll start with the first point. It's incredibly time consuming, like unbelievably time consuming. Maybe some editors don't really read through the papers and just sort of put them into the system and let the reviewers do all the work. But I'm not one of them. I read through it when it actually gets to me. I put some thought into whether I want to send it out for review or not. And if I do send it out for review, I reread it after it comes back in for the second round. I read all the reviewer comments. And believe me, this adds up to, I don't know, realistically, a day a week, like a full day. So super long hours. Second point, I think, is probably an important one to raise. It is a good way to make new enemies that you didn't have before, and to lose some old friends. Oftentimes, if it's a really good friend and their paper's been allocated to me, I actually ask another colleague to handle it because I don't want to have to take the responsibility of telling a really good friend that your paper's been rejected, which is more likely than not going to be the case. And also a good way to make new enemies. Prue mentioned that I'm quite active on Twitter. One time there's someone that we all know, but I'm not going to mention this person's name. We don't know them. They're not at RMIT, but you would know this person just based on the fact that we do similar research. And this person had blocked me on Twitter. I'd never met this person before in my life. I'm like, why is this person blocking me on Twitter? And then I looked into one of this person's postdocs, and the postdoc blocked me too. I'm like, I never met the postdoc before in my life. I'm like, there's some kind of weird thing going on here. And then it turns out, I heard through the grapevine that this person was angry at me because I desk rejected a paper once. And apparently that was enough to set him into a whole rage against me. This is my job, you know, it's nothing personal. In fact, when I look at papers, I don't even look at the names of the people who submit them, and, you know, for the most part, you know, I'll look initially to see who's submitting, but when I actually sit down to, you know, go through my papers and sort of look through, I'm not really paying attention to who it is. I'm just sort of like reviewing it as objectively as possible. But inevitably, because of the statistics being, say, in HRMJ in my journal, the success rate is around 9%, I would say, year on year of, you know, actually getting a paper accepted for publication. That means 9 times out of 10, you're going to be rejected in my journal. And it's nothing personal. It's just the way the game plays. But you will make enemies if you do take this job. And it's probably not a good idea to make those enemies too early in your career, because enemies can have a negative impact in your career trajectory unless you have a lot of resilience. Editors are like co-authors, but we don't get our names in the paper. We put so much time and effort into revising a particular paper, and yet we get absolutely no credit for it. I'm not sure why we do it, because we don't get paid for it either. But for some reason, there's a drive in certain people, a sort of sense of obligation to science or to the discipline to do this kind of work, even though we don't get much credit for it. We don't get institutional support for this kind of work, but we used to. Back when I started at the University of Manchester, the university would actually allocate a full-time, you know, 1 FTE lecturer for the rest of the team in Manchester to be able to edit that particular journal. So they actually got some teaching release and some RA work. But as far as I know, those days are gone. It doesn't really exist. You just have to kind of do it on your own time. It's become particularly difficult recently in the light of COVID-19. It's always been a battle to get people to review papers, but increasingly it's a war. It's no longer a battle, it's all-out war. Just to put it into the context, I need 3 reviewers, right? Don't need, but you ideally want to get 3 reviewers for a paper. I have to make about 25 invitations to get those 3 reviewers, right?
How many?
25.
Really?
Yeah. And let me just say this. If you get an invitation from an editor to review, don't hesitate at all to click decline, because we don't hold that against you in the least bit. In fact, we have the utmost respect for people who immediately write back and decline, because once you decline, we can then move on to the next person in our list. The worst thing you can do, the worst thing you can do is to accept and then never do it. But the second worst thing you can do, which is what I think maybe most people do, is to ignore the invitation and just let it sit there in their inbox, right? Because it creates a difficult situation for us. We don't want to start inviting further reviewers in our list until we have a decision on the ones we've already sent it to. But when people don't respond, we're not exactly sure how we should proceed, and we end up in this difficult situation of either undershooting or overshooting our estimates. So again, for ECRs out there, don't feel guilty at all of clicking decline, because you're actually doing the editor a favor by doing that, by letting him or her know up front that don't worry about it. I can't do it right now, but maybe later. It's not going to have any negative impact on your career. Justin, you have a question?
Yeah, like one thing I think now, because of more sophisticated firewalls and in the email, most of the invitations for the review actually, in my case, they fall under the spam or junk folder, which means that I'm not responding because I don't see it. I see it only when I check it.
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue, and that's not just an issue for inviting people to edit or review a paper. That's also a big issue in terms of getting revised and resubmit and not realizing until a month later that you got it when you go into your junk folder and find out that it's sitting there. So it actually does make sense to every once in a while log into Manuscript Central or whatever platform you're using and just double check. So it's a battle, fewer resources, less time. I think the quality of the reviews under COVID has fallen, and this is obviously going to have a spillover effect in terms of the quality of research downstream. Yes.
Can I?
Yeah.
When you select a reviewer, or you send an invitation to a reviewer, you said sometimes you get quite desperate because 25 invitations to get the 3 reviewers. Now, how do you select these? How do you decide who to send the invitation as a reviewer? Like, of course, you have the board, like that's the first probably. But then after that, like, is someone that necessarily publishing your journal or publishing an A-star journal, or you can really be that desperate that's why everyone can do it?
It's a good question. For those of you listening online, he asked, how do I decide who I invite to review? The first thing I do is if I know someone who's working in the area of the paper, I automatically go to that person. And generally speaking, I get a pretty good response from such people because it's in their area. They're much more likely to review. But oftentimes you won't know people who are working in the areas of the papers that you're handling. And I wish I could show you how this works. There's a search function in Manuscript Central that will allow you to search by keyword. And if your last name begins at the beginning of the alphabet, like Pruse, she's going to get a lot of invitations. And if your last name is the end of the alphabet, like mine, like Timming, you're not going to get so many invitations. And the reason is that we search for a keyword, and then it delivers all the results to us by alphabetical order. So I have a friend, Rajiv Amarnani, who's constantly getting bombarded by reviews, and he never knew why he was getting so many review requests. And I explained to him it's because when we search, it comes up alphabetical order. So unfortunately, if your last name starts with A, you're going to be, the first person invited. So you should know that if, depending on what your last name is, you've hit the jackpot. If your last name is like Zulu or something like that, you're never going to get invited because we will have already sort of reached full capacity by the time we get to that last name. Okay. I often wonder how the peer review system even functions just based on this. I'm quite into memes. I'm into memes. This is, of course, a Drake meme. And I think the real paradox here is that everyone loves other people to review their paper, because when people review the paper, it can move through the system and you can get your publications and you can get your revise and resubmits out. But no one actually likes to review anyone else's paper. And I think this is like sort of encapsulates the challenges that I face as an editor on a day-to-day basis. Is there's a lot of pressure from people who submit papers to me and say, it's been 3 months, why is it taking so long? And it's often not my fault. It's often the fault of the reviewers who don't seem to be able to find the time to commit to this, but they love it when other people find the time to commit to their papers. Okay, so that was just the front end of what goes on behind the scenes, how an editor actually does his or her job. But now I think what you've really come here is for the second end of the paper in terms of what are the insights that I've derived as a result of my time as an editor, and how can you use those insights to improve your own research? I put together a series of tips. This was actually something that I put on Twitter many years back, just a sort of few key insights that I've put together and put out there, and I've sort of collated them for this presentation. So starting with hot tip number 1, always cite at least one paper from the journal to which you are submitting. Show awareness of the journal's key debates. This is something I always do. When I get a paper rejected and I pick the next journal that I'm going to send it to, I always look through that journal, search the, use the search function to find the paper that is at least as closely relevant to what I'm writing about as possible, and cite that paper. Because I don't know how many editors would actually admit it, but oftentimes the first thing they look at in a paper is they scroll back to the reference page to see who's cited and which journals are cited. And if there's no engagement at all with the key debates and controversies that are typically dealt with in a particular journal, your chances of actually getting that into peer review are reduced. So every time you get a paper rejected, when you go on to the next journal, make sure whatever journal you pick, you incorporate at least one citation from that journal, because journals are trying to boost their impact factor, and the more they get cited, the better, right? And if you show that you're aware of various topics that have been regularly discussed in that journal, you're obviously starting off on a good foot with the editor, right? So that one is very important. Second tip, don't get upset with a desk rejection. The editor likely just saved you 3 months of wasted time, right? It's natural to feel almost a sense of grieving when you get a rejection, especially if it's a rejection from a journal that you really desperately want to get into. If you get a desk reject, you submit the paper, you get the desk reject, your natural response might be a bit of anger, a bit of sadness, and it's okay to grieve for a little bit. But what's important for you to bear in mind is that when we desk reject a paper, we do it not because we don't like the paper. Oftentimes I read a really fantastic paper, but it just doesn't fit within the confines of what the journal is publishing on at the particular moment. And when we do desk reject a paper, we're actually saving you a huge amount of time, right? Because it's much better to desk reject it now rather than to send a paper out for review that doesn't stand a reasonable chance of success. Wait for those reviewers to come back, which increasingly can be anywhere between 3 to 6 months, and then reject it anyway. So when you get a desk rejection, you should really be thanking the editor rather than being angry at the editor for giving you the desk rejection, because we have a better sense than anyone in terms of what papers are likely to be accepted into our journal, right? So don't be too angry. In fact, don't be angry at all. You can grieve a little bit. That's okay if you want to feel sad or angry for 24 hours or whatever. But you should be thanking the editor because we just saved you at least 3 to 6 months of time for that paper. I think this is an important one, especially for early career researchers. Full professors already know this because it's just, we've picked this up over the years. But early career researchers oftentimes think that when you get a set of, say, 3 reviews, that you have to do everything that the reviewers say. And if you don't do everything that the reviewers say, then they're going to reject your paper or recommend rejection to the editor. So there's a lot of pressure on early career researchers to respond and action everything that's suggested by reviewers. But like Sam and I were just talking about, oftentimes reviewers are looking for problems that aren't even there, right? I'm convinced that if Plato's The Republic had never been written, and then we can all understand that this is a real masterpiece of philosophy and literature. If it had never been written and was submitted today to Oxford University Press, it would probably get desk rejected, right? Reviewers are looking for problems that aren't there. It's in many ways the nature of being a reviewer, right? Based on that fact, if they're looking for problems that aren't there, they're identifying directions that you probably shouldn't take with the paper because those problems aren't real. So what you need to do is have a good sense of what comments actually make sense and what comments don't make sense. And I would say, it's hard to generalize this, but I would say about 70%, maybe 75% of the comments that you get from reviewers are actually identifying real weaknesses. But then there's the other 25% that if you did that, it would actually probably make the paper worse. You don't have to respond to everything that a reviewer suggests. And increasingly, reviewers are expecting writers or authors to not respond to their suggestions. So they're not going to be angry if you ignore a couple of their suggestions, but you can't really ignore them. When I say you don't have to respond to those suggestions, in fact, you do have to respond to the suggestions. You just don't have to action those particular comments. So if someone makes a comment that's unreasonable or it's taking the paper in a direction that you don't want to go, you do have to address it within your author's note, right? But by addressing it, you can say, thank you very much for this comment. That's a really interesting, direction for future research, and I'll certainly take this into consideration in my next paper. But for now, I think it's better to focus on X, Y, or Z, right? So don't do everything the reviewer suggests, but you certainly do have to address everything that they say, even if it's to say, I'm not going to take up that suggestion. Don't just ignore it in the sense of pretending that it never happened. And this one's huge too, and really important, I think, for early career researchers to get a sense of the importance of this. Your written response to reviewers' comments will make or break the paper. Don't be surprised if the author's note is longer than the manuscript itself. And that's not a joke, right? Author's notes can really go as long as the manuscript itself, especially for some of the, the real top journals. I have personally seen situations where people don't include an author's note at all. When they resubmit, they just resubmit and do the revisions. Okay, you can roll the dice and see what happens. When I send that out to the reviewers have come back and said, I'm not going to review this anymore. I'm going to recommend rejection because I'm not going to sit here and try and figure out what I said previously and how exactly you address those things. And I have no other option but to reject the paper. All right. So don't take this lightly, right? Have a good author's note, an explicit author's note that opens up with, obviously, thank you very much to the editor and the reviewers for these wonderful suggestions. Even if they're not wonderful, you should probably say so. And this, what follows, I'm going to articulate every suggestion you've made and then how I responded or how I actioned or how I addressed that. So I would usually start by like comment 1, and then I would copy and paste the comment that the reviewer made. And then I would say right below it, action 1, and I would talk about exactly how I addressed that comment. Comment 2, copy and paste, action 2, exactly how I responded to that. And if you're doing this right, again, for some of the more elite journals, don't be surprised if your author's note is 20 pages long, single spaced, because that's the nature of the direction of our field. Yeah, this is another one of the behind the scenes tips. I never knew this until I became an editor. And then once I became an editor, I found out that this was the case, and I was quite shocked. We actually, editors, rate you, that is to say reviewers, on the quality and timeliness of your peer reviews. Did you know that? So if you're late, it would perhaps be noted in your overall score. So we have a score from 1 to 3. Or if you have low quality reviews, you actually have a score from 1 to 3. I'm not going to say you should intentionally be late, because that would be, I think, bad advice coming from an editor. But let me just say, with a little wink on the side, oftentimes when we pick reviewers from that list of alphabetical, we look for people with high quality scores. So the better job you do as a reviewer, the more likely you are to get more requests to review. And the worse job you do as a reviewer, the less likely you are to get requests to review. It's kind of curious, isn't it? Anyway, I thought you should know that this database exists. Maria?
Yeah, one question. Usually when we look at journal editor and the team, reviewers team, well, there is a list of academics, etc., etc. But at the same time, we are being invited to review articles, but we are not part of this team. I mean, we can see our names there. How we could progress in our reviewer work, like you did, starting by probably being a reviewer, then et cetera, to be the editor. How is the process?
Oh, to actually get yourself onto an editorial board? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Well, you can start by doing ad hoc reviews. You can log into the journal's Manuscript Central or whatever platform they're using, Editorial Center or whatever, and then you can register yourself as a potential reviewer and pick those keywords, right? And bam, you'll be top of the list when they search for, international HRM, your name will be one of the first that they see. So once you do a few ad hoc reviews, let's say once you do 5 for a journal, at that stage, you can write an editor and say, look, I've been doing a few ad hoc reviews for you. I'd be interested in joining your editorial board. And then at the next editorial board meeting, the editor and the members of the editorial board will consider potential new people to join. Yeah.
I have been reviewing papers in 3-4 different journals for years. I was expecting that I would receive a letter by the editor saying, inviting me. So.
No, you have to be proactive about these things. They will invite, professors, you'll invite professors, but if you're an early career researcher and you want to get an editorial board, you have to be proactive about it. Yeah.
You said they score the reviewer, right? If I receive 10 invitations for reviewer from different journals and I always reject, say no, can't do it. Is there any track record that says that I got lots of invitations, but I always reject it?
Technically, that information would be recorded somewhere in the platform, but no one would ever actually look for that. The only track record is if just in an editor's own mind, they constantly ask one person and they're constantly saying no, and they happen to remember that, then it can work against you.
Andrew, we have a question in the chat function. Is the reviewer rated database shared between journals and platforms? For example, Sage and Elsevier?
No, in fact, I don't even think it's shared within a particular platform. It's only visible to people in that particular journal. Okay, next tip. There's quite a few tips to get through. There is a scientific formula for successful publication. Identify a problem. If you don't have a problem that you've identified, then you're not on a very good road, so to speak. Review the literature, identify a gap in the literature. If you're actually writing about something that 100,000 people have already written about, and you're not actually adding anything new or exciting to the literature, then you're probably not on a very good road. Fill that gap with your research. Reiterate that you filled that gap with your research in the discussion, and then your paper gets accepted. So this is the general formula. I know it's easier said than done, but pay attention to each element in that equation, because if you're not actually ticking a box in each element, then you're making your chances of success a lot lower than they could be. This one I feel a little bad about putting in there because I know it contributes to this sort of culture of overwork, and I don't want to do that, but I did want to at least raise the issue that in order to compete at the highest levels, you can't be completely confident in your abilities as a writer. The minute you have total confidence in what you're doing as a writer, as an author, is the minute you stop progressing. We progress based on the sort of projections and goals that we put for ourselves. And as long as we think we're doing an excellent job in the moment, we're probably not going to reach that next level, right? You also have to have this sort of sense of a desperate sense of embedding continuous improvements in yourself. And no matter what level you reach as an academic, you're never going to move to the next level unless you think that whatever paper you just did isn't good enough for you anymore, right?
Sounds exhausting.
It is. But I thought about, rather than telling you what you want to hear, it's probably better just to tell you how the industry really works.
May I just add to that? I feel this is great to have, but it's really dangerous for perfectionists because it might actually impede you to submit the paper in the first place, because you feel, especially as a young academic, that your research is not good enough. So you spend, like, talking about my own case, I'm spending way too many years on improving some papers and having rotating through 4 or 5 conferences where this paper should have been submitted already long ago. And we're only now getting advice from more senior scholars who tell me you're kind of like perfecting the paper way too much before submission. So I think this is kind of like equally important, because I think we're all doubting ourselves already like a lot, and it can really impede action to submit.
Yeah, it can. It's about, I guess, finding an equilibrium, right? In any other kind of social or economic context, you're always looking for that equilibrium. You can go too far, it's going to have negative effects. You don't go far enough, it's going to have negative effects. You need to find that sweet spot. Agreed. Before you submit, always scan the journal's editorial board and identify the one person most likely to be assigned your paper and cite that person's work. Academics have big egos and they love to see their last name cited in papers. And whether we're willing to admit this or not, we think that success is all about merit in academia. It's really not. It's about actually pursuing the right strategies. And if you have an idea that a particular member of the editorial board is likely to be assigned your paper, and you cite that person's work repeatedly, or at least a couple times in the paper, and then that person actually does get the paper and sees that you're citing him or her, you're much more likely to have positive feedback from that reviewer than otherwise. This one I've already talked about, so we don't need to cover this, but yes, just to reiterate, you get an invitation to review a paper, you don't want to review it, just say you don't want to review it, right? Don't hesitate at all. Just click decline. I do it all the time. In fact, I can't remember the last time I actually accepted an invitation to review when I wasn't on an editorial board. Just click decline, automatically sends a message back to the editor. No worries, totally fine.
Andrew, may I just,
yeah.
so this question doesn't get lost in the rest of the chat. Mother has a question, and she's asking if you've got any tips about getting conceptual papers published in journals that aren't review journals, because the formula you cited before is slightly different for conceptual papers, arguably.
I published one theory paper, peer theory paper in my life, and I'll never do it again. I had to go through 4 rounds of review, and each round was virtually a complete rewrite of that paper, like literally from top to bottom. And I found that without empirical content in a paper that anchors it, once there's empirical content, the reviewers are constrained in what directions they can ask you to take a paper. But if there's no empirical content at all, it's a free-for-all. And you will literally struggle, unlike anything you've ever struggled with, to try and get a purely theoretical paper published. It can be done, and there are obviously a few specific, theory outlets, Human Resource Management Review or Academy Management Review. There are some like that. I would say with respect to systematic literature reviews, your chances of success are greater because in some ways it's a little bit empirical. It's not just purely theoretical. But if you want my honest suggestion, don't commit to only theoretical papers. If you have data that you can use, put that data in there and roll with that.
How about qualitative versus quantitative?
Again, my honest opinion, quantitative papers are so much easier to do and take so much less time. But if you're willing to put forth the time into a good qualitative paper and you have a good number of interviews, that doesn't actually, it will harm you in some journals, but it's not going to harm your chances overall of getting a paper accepted. You have a qualitative paper, you can still get it into Academy of Management Journal, but you're going to need to do 300 interviews. If you're doing 300 interviews, you're practically approaching quantitative research anyway.
Can I just tell a super quick anecdote about that? I went to the Academy of Management conference as a PhD student, and I sat down for breakfast opposite an older gentleman, and he was making polite conversation with me, and he said, so what sort of research do you do? And I was telling him, he said, no, what methods do you use? And I said, I'm purely qualitative, and he said, And he gave me like a sympathy card.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm really sorry to hear that. He said, life is going to be so tough for you. He said, now you need to do yourself a favour, go to all the quant classes you can that are on offer in your school, build up your quant skills.
I hope I heard this when I was doing my PhD. Too late.
I wish I had come into breakfast a little late and joined your table to say the rewards of doing qualitative research are vast and wonderful.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
It was kind of
that divide is extraordinarily frustrating.
You should have just said, at least I'm not a theorist.
I like theory.
I know, I'm being facetious. All right, so I have quite a few to get through. I'll see if I can get through these as fast as I can, again, without sacrificing any of the insight. This one was a bit controversial when I made this suggestion, and that's know the ethos of the journal before you submit. Don't submit a Marxist paper to a mainstream journal, nor a mainstream journal to a Marxist journal. I think this one's important. Know exactly what this type of journal is about and the types of arguments that they make before you submit, because oftentimes a journal article will be rejected, again, because of what editors will call lack of fit. And this is called lack of fit. This doesn't fit well with the debates going on in our journal. So make sure you're aware of what those debates are. And although it's great to kind of shake things up a little bit, and ideally that should be the best way that science should unfold, in practice, you're going to be going up an uphill battle, so to speak, if you submit a paper that's inconsistent with the sort of main currents of research being published in that journal.
Can I just I'm really surprised by the reaction that you said you got, because for me that should be tip one.
You would think so, yeah.
You pick the right journal,
Yeah.
look for the right fit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not about not, pushing the boundaries of a particular journal. It's about saying, who do you want to read? Who do you want reading your work?
Yeah.
Which part of the debate do you want to influence? And picking the right journal is key. And often why you get the desk reject.
Yeah.
Because the fit's just not there.
Agree. Yeah. So as I said before, oftentimes when you get reviewer comments, they can say all kinds of wild things. And oftentimes when you get comments, they will send you in different directions. And it's easy as an early career researcher to get lost in those different directions that reviewers want you to go in. And when that happens, when you have two reviewers that are literally opposing themselves, don't hesitate to write us, the editor, and say, look, reviewer one saying I should do this and reviewer two saying I should do that. These will take us in two completely different directions. Which do you think I should focus on? And more often than not, we're very happy to weigh in on this confidentially. Sam?
In an email before we get into the revise and resubmit, is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
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 Just get advice before you get into the
Yeah.
battle.
Write the editor before you actually jump in and say, look, I need some clarification. Because, with three people reviewing a paper, they're obviously going to have different interpretations of the way it should go. And oftentimes it's almost impossible to reconcile them. And when that happens, you need direction from the editor who can say, and I've said this before, ignore reviewer two. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Ignore reviewer three. She's heading in the wrong direction, right? I'm happy to say that. I'm not sure how relevant this one is to you, but if you feel particularly strongly that a particular academic should not review your paper, you can make this request to the editor in the cover letter. Few editors would ignore you.
They wouldn't spite you?
It would be unlikely. I can only speak for myself. I mean, if they really didn't want your paper in there, they wouldn't have sent it out for review in the first instance. So if you tell an editor, I've had, I would prefer, you don't even need to give any contacts. You can just say, I would prefer this paper not go to whoever. And it's pretty likely that the editor would accommodate that request without making a big deal about it. Yeah.
So not your breakfast panic.
Yeah. I've already talked about this one briefly. It's okay to grieve if you get a rejection. It's natural to feel sad or a little angry about it. But don't don't get obsessed with that. You know, it's important to put things into context and realize that eventually every paper that you submit will find a home in the end. It may not be the actual home that you wanted for it in the first place, but it will find a home. Just move on within 24 hours to address what needs to be addressed. As I said, the paragraph from the editor is the key there. Address what the editor says more than anyone else, and then move on to your next journal. When you get an unreasonably harsh review, please don't turn around and give the next person an unreasonably harsh review, because an unreasonably harsh review for an unreasonably harsh review makes the whole world unpublished. And I guess this is kind of reflected in a little bit of what Sam said. Reviewers feel an obligation to find things wrong with the paper. And I'm completely against this as a matter of principle. If you read a paper and even in the first round, you think it's great, tell me. I'm okay with that, and I will consider that a high quality review. If you say, look, I think this is publishable, maybe a few changes here and there, that's perfectly fine. It's okay to give minor revisions in the first round. Don't feel obligated to find enough problems to justify major revisions.
Andrew, I have been thinking about something for a while. I don't think that can happen in reality, but just as a wishful thinking, when you get these letters, the decision letter and then the referee comments, sometimes I feel I would love to have a conversation rather than like a dialogue rather than a monologue, because sometimes referees don't get what you say, or sometimes they don't read certain part of the paper. You want to have a little like nice conversation, but the whole referee process is more like a monologue. They say, and then you can't just discuss and clarify properly. You have to make certain decisions. It was just a wishful thinking that has knocked about my mind. If the whole process can be changed somehow dramatically, rather than a monologue, we can have a dialogue.
We are changing it. In fact, if you don't mind, I'll make a little plug for my role as the registered reports editor at HRMJ. Registered reports is exactly what you're describing. See, the problem with, so a registered report, for those of you who don't know, means that you submit for peer review essentially a proposal for your paper, right? You write the introduction, you write the literature review, you develop your hypotheses, and you articulate a research design. And at that stage, you have that back and forth dialogue, because you haven't actually already collected the data. You haven't actually already analyzed the results. See, that's the problem, is with full papers that get submitted in the traditional method, there's a lot of conflict and a lot of disagreement. Whereas if you start with a registered report, in other words, you wait until you get a conditional acceptance at stage 1 of the registered report before you move on to collect the data, then you can have that kind of dialogue with reviewers in a way that you couldn't have if you submit a full paper. Because sometimes there's not scope for much dialogue if they're just diametrically opposed to whatever method you've used or whatever findings you've uncovered. So there is some scope for that. Next tip, and I think I wrote this several years ago, I would probably change that 3 to a 5 now. If you expect that you will have to spend X hours working on a paper to get it into a top journal, the actual number of hours required is X times 3. And as I said, it's probably X times 5 now. And unfortunately, this is the nature of academia, right? The expectations for publications are being ratcheted up literally month by month or year by year. And oftentimes we blame our universities and say, well, they're putting too much pressure on us to publish. It's not really our universities. It's the whole system is moving in that direction. The universities are simply responding to the whole system. So every year the expectations go up higher and higher, and we constantly have to recalibrate in our minds how much effort is required for a particular paper. And even I struggle with this sometimes. I'll do a paper, I just wrote a paper that had, secondary analysis of a data set with 50,000 people, and there were 10 different, logistic regression analyses, and it came at it from all different angles. And that wasn't even close to enough when I submitted the paper, right? That would have been more than enough in 2006, not anymore, because this is the nature of the field that we've chosen. The standards, the performance benchmarks are going up. And I think that's a lot of the conflict a lot of academics have, is because whenever they start, They have a particular set of benchmarks in their mind in terms of what it was like when I started. But then 5 years later, those benchmarks are completely wiped out. They don't exist anymore, but we have a hard time in our mindset of letting go what it used to be like. We have to get into the mindset of, if you really want to get into these top A-star journals, it's going to take 3 or 5 times more time than we think it's going to take.
A lot of support in the chat for that point.
True. One of the best things in early career research to do is join an editorial board. It will give you invaluable insight into the inner workings of a journal. I've already said this. It was brutal for me when I joined the Work, Employment, and Society editorial board. I was dealing with 22 papers a year. It was basically my Saturdays. That's where they went back in that day. You know, it was hard work, but the return on that investment was worth it in terms of refining my own writing. Because when you spend every Saturday reading about all the mistakes that people make when they submit a paper to a particular journal that you're on the editorial board of, you internalize those mistakes and avoid them when in your own writing, whether you're conscious of that or not. Sometimes it happens unconsciously, but there is a good return on that investment in spite of the huge amount of time it takes to join an editorial board. This is one that we've already talked about. If there's not a problem with the paper, just say so. Don't feel obligated to look for problems that aren't there. This one I probably don't need to say, probably more important for PhD students to hear this than for academics, but don't submit a paper to more than one journal simultaneously. And the reason I put this in here is that the pressures to publish are huge and massive. And given those pressures to publish, oftentimes people will be inclined to take shortcuts to get a publication. I mean, let's face it, if we had a paper and we submitted it to 17 different journals, we would probably have a good revise and resubmit within 3 months. Rather than having to submit sequentially to those 17 journals, it could take 10 years, right? So there's clearly a shortcut if you want to, but if you go down that route, you're really rolling the dice because it is misconduct and potentially a terminable offense. This one may be a little bit controversial, but I think it's probably true. I think it's better to publish 1 paper per year in a top journal than 5 papers per year in average journals. I'm not going to define top or average because sometimes those are not so easily encapsulated in, for example, journal lists. If you're a, if you're a heterodox Marxist, your top journal is not going to be Academy of Management Journal. It's going to be Cambridge Journal of Economics, which maybe is not a top journal from other people's perspective, but it is a top journal for what you do. Marco?
Would you put this sentence in the context of what stage in our career we are? Because, I'll give an example. Generally speaking, I agree with this statement that 1 good quality rather than 5 lower quality, whatever is lower and higher.
Yeah.
But for example, as an early career, you still need to establish your name, your capability as a researcher. So probably aiming for the 1 good one, it will take too long. And in the meantime, you don't have time to build your reputation across the.
Yeah, I've seen this happen, and it especially happens in America where you have a tenure track clock that's 6 years or so, and you have a large number of people who don't make it. I'd say it's about a 50% chance of actually getting tenure at a Research One American university. And the main downfall is they take this too literally, right? So they will literally spend those 6 years trying to get published in the Academy of Management Journal. And then at the end of those 6 years, they end up with nothing because it's really hard to get published in that journal. So I guess my best advice for early career researchers is at any one time, always be working on 1 paper that's A-star quality, right? That should be your aspiration. If you have a couple A's or even some B's, even a couple C's, and there's some debate over whether B's or C's can actually hurt your CV versus helping your CV, and there's been some academic research on this, but the general consensus, at least in business and management, is it's not going to hurt. Apparently it's different with economists. They're quite a bunch of snobs, the economists, like they only want A-stars. But yeah, definitely take into consideration it's better to have a few publications than none at all.
Well, because you can't guarantee that you'll get 1 paper a year in the top journal.
Yeah.
You can't guarantee at all, and that can be and this can big career suicide.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because having no publications for sure, just waiting to get that, top journal, to accept it, they may not after 4 rounds of revise and resubmit. You could still get a rejection.
Yeah, you can.
And
Yeah,
you're
absolutely.
supposed to be building your research profile, which is something that should be, broader than just this obsession with top journals. And the problem at the moment is we're using a research active measure where B journals somehow are not seen as important.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, it's about achieving that equilibrium. You go too far, you end up like the people who don't get tenure at the end because they have nothing. But if you go too far in the other direction, then you're in trouble as well.
Andrew, back to the editorial board. Does an ACR have to have a good publication record to be able to get into editorial boards of decent journals, like A-star journals?
Generally, yes.
Okay.
You should have at least published one paper with that journal, at least one paper.
That journal.
Yeah. Again, I'm quite active on Twitter. I think for my sins, sometimes I think it does me more harm than good, but occasionally I have a little bit of insight that I put out there. And this is one that I thought was worth sharing with you. Probably the most important piece of advice here, I'm given in every single slide. Good co-authors work directly on a paper. Bad co-authors leave bubble comments and other co-authors to address. This advice is pure gold, trust me. So when you're a co-author and someone sends you the paper to comment on, don't just make comments to send back for that person to do. You're a co-author. Contribute to the paper, write new paragraphs, make changes. Don't feel that you're not capable of contributing. I think I've talked to other people about this. They feel like, well, I just, if a professor sends me a paper and asks me to comment or make changes to it, I just don't feel like I can add anything that would, add value to the paper. You wouldn't be on the team if that were the case, right? There's an expectation that rather than just giving comments and sending it back for you to do it, that you actually carry through with those comments and make the changes yourself. Academia can drag you down because rejection is the norm, not the exception. You must celebrate every success, no matter how small. Set small goals and throw a mini party for yourself when you meet them, right? We don't get a lot of wins in academia. They're few and far between, especially when it comes to publishing. So even getting a revise and resubmit is a win. Celebrate it. Go out for, ice cream that night or whatever. When you get a revise and resubmit, literally drop everything and tackle it right away. Don't sit on it for the maximum time allowed. A lot of people wait until the deadline approaches and then they submit right before the deadline. Nah, the sooner you submit the revisions, the more stellar your career. And plus, when you submit the revisions sooner, it's going to be more fresh in the minds of the viewers. Of course, you don't want to submit the next day because obviously that will tell the reviewers that you haven't done enough effort. But don't wait until the deadline before you resubmit. Now, this is actually the most important one. More than anyone that I'm giving you on these tips, this is the most important one. Good co-authors are few and far between. When you find one, never let go. Nurture that relationship like you would a childhood friendship. It's worth more than its weight in gold. And I can't overemphasize how important this one is. When you find, because there are a lot of bad experiences you're going to have in co-authoring too. You're going to find co-authors that, again, like the bubble comments. You ask, can you make changes to, the literature review? And then they write back with some bubble comments saying, this is what you need to do. And then you think stuff, what am I, a PhD student? I'm a co-author. I'm asking you to make some changes. Can you make some changes too?
You are a co-author too.
Yeah, exactly. When you find co-authors that actually make the changes, that don't suggest there's work that needs to be done, but you do it, that actually do the work, never let go of these people because they're so important to your career.
Oh, Andrew, have you got the reverse of that? The bad co-author?
Yeah.
Let go immediately.
Let go immediately, yeah.
And that's actually really hard. Yes, I know. We all laugh until we have that experience.
Yeah.
And it's like, see the scars.
Yeah.
But that's the other thing. Don't work with them again. If you've had a really bad experience and you can't pull out, just don't don't continue the relationship.
Absolutely.
The problem is that they never go.
Yeah.
Is controversial a little bit. Panos has made a really interesting comment, I think, about actually not being afraid to ask for an extension if you need it to do justice to the reviews. So I don't know whether you have a rejoinder.
Yeah.
Pacing yourself to tackle everything in detail.
If you need an extension, if something comes up that impedes your progress, something urgent, or this is what we have ropes for, right? If something comes up that means you can't work on it at a particular time, don't be afraid to ask an extension. I've never, ever in my entire career as an editor across multiple requests ever said no to an extension. I don't see the purpose in it, but I was told by a friend that someone told them no. It was like the most bizarre thing I've ever heard. I can't imagine why anyone would care. Yeah, if you need extra time, don't be afraid to ask for it. But I'm just saying procrastination leads to a sort of more procrastination and a sort of slower trajectory for your career. And if you're fine, you know, that's a perfectly legitimate way to move your way through academia. If you're not in a hurry, then take your time and you know, do it when you feel you have the time. But I would just say that if your concern is to move yourself up through the ranks quickly, the quicker you get to that information, to that revision, the better, right? Drop everything. That's your priority, right? If something else comes up, that can probably wait because you do need to focus on your revisions. Just very briefly, because I have to go in a couple minutes, but I want to make sure I get through all the slide. I hate this more than anyone, right? This idea that you have to, every time you change journals, you kind of have to change things around. It takes like an hour to kind of, you know, conform to their requirements. But it's better to actually do it up front, put in the half an hour rather than submitting the paper. And then 4 weeks later, you get editorial assistant right back saying you haven't, you know, formatted your paper properly, and then you have to format it later, right? So as much as it's kind of a pain, it's worthwhile just to do it. Make sure you proofread your paper. This does happen occasionally. You may have seen this before. This was actually published. Obviously, in the last round of revise and resubmit, someone put a little comment in there saying, should we cite the crappy Gabor paper here? And I think it's just a matter of time before someone says, should we cite that crappy Timming paper here? But I put this in here just to make sure that you do pay attention to the you know, the stylistics and the aesthetics of a paper, and make sure you proofread it when the production assistant sends you the draft to proof it. Actually read it, because I've caught a few mistakes in my own writing in doing so. Don't just say, oh yeah, I'm sure it's fine. It's been through 4 rounds of review. I'm sure it's good. It's not always good. Just a few more reflections. It's a tough game. It's getting tougher. One study isn't enough anymore. You know, these days you have to have study 2, study 3, study 4. The simplest method may be the most appropriate method, and I would totally agree with that, but increasingly the more complex methods are the ones that get published in the top journals these days. So the more esoteric your technique, the better chances you have of success. You can't get away with old wine in new bottles anymore. We used to be able to do this. Academics were tautologists. We would say the same thing over and over and over again with different language. But it turns out that we've sort of passed that point. You can't get away with that. You want to get something published, you actually have to be contributing something new to the debates, not something that's already been answered and understood. Please don't badger us for reviews if they're late. It's often not our problem. We talked about the fact that theory papers are much harder to get published than empirical papers. But most importantly, I think, is this last point. Yes, publishing is important, but it's not as important as spending quality time with your family and friends. So if any advice I've given you during this presentation interferes with your time with family and friends, then I would beg you, in fact, please ignore it. I'm sorry, I don't have time for questions. I do have to go in 1 minute. There's an industry partner that's waiting for me outside building 80. However, I'm very happy to take questions offline, or if you just want to shoot me a question, that would be fine too. Thank you very much.
Talking about industry, how do you provide a journal to industry people? I mean, do industry people or HR managers rate the journal?
HRMJ, Human Resource Management Journal, probably has I would say among journals, the best connections with industry. We actually have a set of practitioners that read it, but it doesn't come easily because most industry people look negatively on the review because it's meaningless. Yeah, exactly.
I feel it's unceremonial not to thank you, Andrew, for your time and give you, I know there's not many people here in the room, but there's actually a lot of people online that's been recorded. That was fantastic. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Good day.
You too.
And we hope everyone's enjoyed it at home as well. And I will log off in some fashion.